Okay, I guess we're live. Hello, everybody. My name is Juanita, and today, what I am expecting we do is a deep dive into the politics and the international relationships of Latin America. This is not going to be as thorough as I wish it were, A, because we have a short amount of time, but B, because I am not as thorough in my knowledge about politics and international relationships of Latin America. I do have knowledge and, well, done my fair bit of research, but do not expect this to be like ultimate knowledge on Latin America. Perhaps there's some things that I am going to briefly just cover. If you have any doubts, if you want anything in particular that you are expecting this to cover, please type it in the chat and I'll do my best to try to cover it during this hour and a half, perhaps 2 hours if we have a lot of questions. But to start off, this is a brief roadmap of what we're doing today. So first of all, we're going to start with a brief history of things that I think are important to know in terms of what has happened in Latin America and what has shaped the current politics that we see now in Latin America. And then we're going to talk about the current politics that we see in Latin America. We're going to talk about the political structure and the political instability that we see in Latin America, factors that may be important for you to characterize in debates about Latin America. And second, we're going to talk about civil and social unrest, how it plays out in most of the countries of Latin America, and aspects that may be good for you to have in mind when you are doing arguments on protests and unrest as a whole in the continent. Then we're going to talk about international relations. We're going to talk about Guyana and Venezuela and what's happening right now there. We're going to talk about Colombia and Nicaragua and the border controversy that has been existing since 2012 or the 2010s. And then we're going to talk about the migration crisis in Mexico, in Colombia, and the Venezuelan diaspora in the whole Latin American community. Then we're going to briefly talk about economics, the main trading blocks that we have in Latin America, and we're going to talk briefly about Argentina and Javier Milei's proposition to dollarize the country. And lastly, we have time, we're going to do a brief Q&A if something has slipped my mind or if you want any more info in whatever you want. So quick, I don't know, housekeeping rules. If you have any doubts, if you want to ask anything, please do so during the whole workshop. Do not hesitate to ask anything. If you want to unmute yourselves, go ahead and unmute yourselves. If you want to type the questions in the chat for everyone to see, if you want to type them for just me to see, that's perfectly fine as well. Do so as the questions arise so that I can go them in about them in a rolling basis. So yeah, let's start off then with a brief history of Latin America. So Latin America is basically part or the continent of South America, and it's comprised of the countries that have been colonized either and mostly by Spain and Brazil that was colonized by Portugal. So 3 things that I think are key for you to understand current politics in Latin America and how they are shaped. So we have a huge history of dictatorships, we have a huge history of US intervention, and we have a huge history of guerrilla warfare. I'm going to cover those briefly so that you can see how they affect currently Latin American politics. So first of all, in terms of dictatorships, most of the countries in Latin America during the in a span of the 50s and the 70s, went through periods of dictatorships. So, for example, in Argentina, we had the junta militar that was controlled by Videla, and basically there were extrajudicial killings, disappearances, control of the government over the public sphere, over the freedom of speech, over the freedom of movement. And basically, after this dictatorship in Argentina, what we had was a period of transition into democracy, and then some acts of restorative justice and of truth towards the population. We have a movement that's very well known in Argentina, known as the movement of Las Madres de Plaza de Mayo, which were mothers of people who were disappeared during the regime, that were asking for information on where the bodies of their children were, of what happened to them, and why were they persecuted by the government. Similarly, we have the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet in Chile, that was heavily intervened or heavily coadjuvated by the US government. I am going to cover that in the next one. Then we have Brazil, Paraguay with Stroessner, but basically most of the countries in Latin America have endured dictatorships. Colombia had a dictator, but it wasn't as gruesome and as oppressive as the other regimes in Latin America. But most of the countries that you see in Latin America, this is Panama, Guatemala, Argentina, Chile, Brazil, Paraguay, have gone through a period of dictatorship, and this basically has shaped the way in which people engage with the executive power as of now. This means there is a strong distrust in giving a lot of power to the executive. This looks like, for example, having an interest in strengthening local and national courts in order for them to be able to control the government and to control the executive. This is also abilities that Congress and national assemblies have to overthrow governments and to overthrow presidents, such as through things like impeachment processes. And this basically funnels the discourse of the left, because most of these dictatorships were aligned with the far right, and this nowadays funnels the discussion and the campaigning that most of the left wing has in most of the Latin American countries, which is saying that there is a need to overthrow the right because of the harms they have done in the past in most of the countries, and ultimately because of the whitewashing that they do of the dictatorships that have happened in the past. So, for example, you have politicians in Chile that still defend the regime that was done by Augusto Pinochet. You have here in Colombia people in politics whitewashing what has been done by the government in terms of oppression of the people, in terms of extrajudicial killings, and therefore the left has a very strong narrative against these past dictatorships, and oftentimes characterizes people from the right as aligned with these past dictatorships and as a risk of going back into those past dictatorships. So ultimately, we do have a political discourse that is heavily influenced by what has happened in the past in terms of dictatorships in the continent. The second thing is the U.S. intervention. So this is something that might be similar to what the U.S. has done in other latitudes in the world, but basically this ranges from actually intervening in politics and giving the ability of dictators to stay in power, such as, for example, the intervention of the U.S. in the killings of Salvador Allende and the CIA's presence in Chile during the killing of Salvador Allende, and then the coup d'etat that was done by Augusto Pinochet, who was the dictator that Chile had for a long time. This is, for example, the intervention that the U.S. did in Guatemala in 1954 to put Arbenz into power after left-wing governor was stated. But this also ranges from financing of paramilitary groups in Nicaragua, for example, or counterinsurgency groups in Nicaragua. This goes like Operación Cóndor in Colombia to fight FARC and to fight narco traffic. And basically, it's the financing and the heavy incentive for countries in Latin America to be very oppressive towards their population and to be very controlling of violence and violent groups. So, for example, in Operación Cóndor in Colombia, what we had was a very a strong intervention of the U.S. in our security system, in our military and our militias. So basically, the training of these militias by the U.S. government, the financing of arms and of different strategies of the U.S. government, the agreement to give the U.S. government say in the strategies that Colombia applied in terms of security and in terms of fighting against our guerrilla, that was FARC and ELN. And basically that means that most, and this is also funneled or used by the left, which is that the right has always been able to sell themselves to the imperialism done by the US. And ultimately, most of the left-wing parties in most of Latin American countries are against that US intervention, characterize it as imperialism, characterize it as losing sovereignty and giving it to the US. And ultimately, then, it is a vision of nationalism that is built on the idea of being independent of the US, not using the US aid, and not letting US be able to intervene in the public policy and the policies in terms of strategy and in terms of national security that most of these countries apply nowadays. And lastly, we have a huge history of guerrilla warfare. This starts over with Che Guevara in Cuba, that has a Marxist revolution that is successful, but then this also happens in most or in a lot of countries in Latin America. For example, in Peru, we have a huge history of Sendero Luminoso, which was a guerrilla that wanted a class revolution, wanted to go against the oligarchs and the right-wing elite in the center of Peru. and it was mainly integrated by farmers and people from the agricultural sector, and what is called in Peru as La Sierra, which is basically the peripheral and the places in the mountains of Peru that are heavily underdeveloped because of a centralization government that favors the center in Peru, the center being Lima, Arequipa, and most of the center of Peru. And then we have also in Peru, Tupac Amaru, which is an indigenous guerrilla, but most of these guerrillas have an ideology that is based on the Marxist revolution and the Leninist revolution, and therefore this is what funnels the discourse of the right, which is most of the people who are part of the left are characterized as whitewashing the acts of terror and of violence that were done by guerrillas when they were in existence. For example, in Peru, you have people saying that the past president that was Pedro Castillo, being tied to Sendero Luminoso, being tied to the guerrilla warfare that was happening in Peru during Fujimori's regime. And therefore, what you have is a right that characterizes people in the left as people who are anti-regime, people who are violent, and people who want a Marxist revolution and not just have social democrat stances in terms of their political views, but people who are going to go against private property, people who are going to go against basic human rights. And therefore, what you have is a huge polarization based on all these historical factors that play into that come into play in most of the Latin American countries. But this is not something that only happens in Peru. You have it in Nicaragua with the Frente Sandinista de Liberación Nacional, that basically went into power and ultimately became a dictatorship and had extrajudicial killings, had disappearances, had a violent regime that ultimately killed everyone that was in opposition to them. We also have a huge guerrilla warfare in Colombia that started off in 1963 with ELN, or by how you would say in English, ELN, which is Ejército de Liberación Nacional, National Liberation Army. And then we have FARC that demobilized after 2016's peace agreement, but we do have people who were not part of the agreement and now are concurrently still fighting in what we call disidencias de las FARC, which is basically a wing of FARC that never agreed to the peace agreement and are still infighting and are still doing kidnappings and doing narco trafficking in the regions that they controlled, that is the regions in the border with Ecuador and the border with Venezuela. And we also have M19 or M19, which was a urban guerrilla that was mainly based in Cali and in Bogota. And currently our president, who's Gustavo Petro, who's left-winger, is a former militant of M19. And basically what we have here in Colombia then is this polarization between the people in the right wing that characterize Gustavo Petro as someone who is going against private property, someone that has been violent, that has blood in their hands because they were part of the guerrilla. And basically what we have is this polarization created by the right against the left, and all the history of violence that has been surrounded by this idea of fighting guerrilla, of the different ways in which guerrillas were fought in Colombia, which basically meant we had extrajudicial killings by the military for them to be able to say that they were able to diminish guerrillas. So they killed young people that had nothing to do with the war and with guerrillas, and they were framed as being part of militants of those guerrillas in order for the military to show results. And this is something that has created a landmark of polarization in Colombia, but in most of the countries in Latin America, which is this huge fight in which you characterize or create a narrative of the other side being a harm or a risk for the political arena. And that's why we have a very polarized politics nowadays in most of the Latin American countries. So having that in mind, what is the current political leanings that we have in Latin America? Most of the countries nowadays in Latin America are left, center left. We have some that are center right and some that are right. This map is not updated to show Javier Milei winning Argentina. So if you see here, Argentina should be blue because Javier Milei won the elections last month and already is ruling over Argentina. Now Argentina is blue because Javier Milei has right-wing politics. And mostly we have Lula da Silva in Brazil being part of the left. We have Maduro in Venezuela being part of the left. We have Gustavo Petro in Colombia being part of the left. We have Guillermo Lasso in Ecuador that is part of the right. We have in Peru Dina Boluarte, which is center left. In Mexico, we have AMLO, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, being part of the left. In Panama, we have center right with Nito, and in most of the countries, you have Nicaragua and Honduras that have right-wing presidents. Guatemala also has a right-wing president. We have Paraguay and Uruguay having also right-wing presidents, but mostly nowadays Latin America is ruled by the left. This has not been so, for example, for Chile, that has a very pendular presidential system. So before we had Boric, we had Piñera, that was from the right. In Colombia, this is the first time we have a president that is a leftist president. We had always been ruled by the center right or the right, and I'm going to explain why we had this sheer change towards the left in when I cover civil and social unrest. Right. So few things are important in terms of the political structure and the political instability we have in Latin America. The first thing I want to point out is Latin American countries other than Venezuela are not failing states, do not have an issue in terms of democracy, do not have an issue in terms of the security or the amount of confidence you can have in terms of democratic elections. Most of the democratic elections we have in Latin America are fair and square. You should not be saying that most of the countries in Latin America have an issue in terms of authoritativeness or an issue in terms of the safeness of their democratic elections. Most of the elections we have in Latin America are safe, have international scrutiny. So there's no such thing as a democratic problem in Latin America, and you should not be saying so just because there is a democratic issue and a lack of confidence in the democratic institutions in Venezuela. Not all countries in Latin America are Venezuela. You should not be doing these characterizations. They are a big mischaracterization and a big generalization of what currently happens in Latin America. What we do have in Latin America is fragile and corrupt institutions. This means that institutions can be co-opted by rulers and by presidents and by the political elite, but this does not mean that we do not have division of power. This does not mean that we do not have minimum guarantees of democracy and of rights in most of the Latin American countries. And I want to be super clear on this, because I hate it when people say that Latin America has no minimum guarantees. This is a lie. Most of the judiciary system and courts are very strong in Latin America, are very independent, and are not co-opted by the political arena. And this is key for you to understand. We do have a huge division of power. For example, in Peru, the former president Alberto Fujimori was in jail because of the harms and the violence they did during their rule. We have now in Colombia, we are investigating Álvaro Uribe because of extrajudicial killings, because of issues they had during their government. So saying that Latin American countries do not have a division of powers is a lie, a very big lie, and you should not be engaging in those kinds of lies. We do have fragile institutions. We do have issues in terms of separation of powers, but that does not mean that we do not have check and balances in our political arena. We have a strong independent judiciary system. You can see it in Peru, you can see it in Panama, that in the last few months was able to go against the decision of the government of joining a mining contract, and I'm gonna go over that in the future in the workshop. Colombia is investigating its former and most important president, Álvaro Uribe. Chile has a very strong constitutional court that has been able to uphold the standards of rights and the standards of good way of living after the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet. So saying that we do not have a strong judiciary system or a protection of human rights is not very accurate and not very reflective of the truth. There is an issue in applying the decisions that are being made by courts. That is a fact, but you cannot characterize or say that there is no judiciary protection in Latin America. What we do have is an abuse of the impeachment process, which has created in most of the countries of Latin America political instability. This happened in Brazil in 2016 with Dilma Rousseff. This has happened in Peru over like 3 or 4 times in the last 5 years. This has happened in Ecuador this year, and I'm going to cover those briefly. So in Brazil in 2016, there was an impeachment process against Dilma Rousseff, who was the president of Brazil at the time. And basically, Dilma was accused of 2 things. A, not being able to or being negligent in the administration of Petrobras during Operation Car Wash and all the corruption that happened during Operation Car Wash, because Dilma Rousseff was part of the board of directors of Petrobras during the time, and she was accused of budgetary mishandling because she approved social programs without going to Congress. But the problem was that this was characterized not only by the left media, but by the New York Times, by many respectable media outlets in Western media as a political coup, which is the impeachment process was used against Dilma in order for sacking her of power. And this was a coup that was orchestrated by Dilma's vice president, who was Michel Temer. And basically what this has done in Brazil is create a lot of polarization over the decision of throwing out of power Dilma Rousseff, but also a lack of confidence in the use of the impeachment process, a lack of confidence in the National Assembly, and basically a notion that impeachment processes are not used adequately, are used to create political instability, and are used for basically ousting governors when people in the National Assembly do not agree with them. Second one, so Peru, going from Pedro Pablo Kuczynski to Dina Boluarte, basically Peru has had over 5 or 6 presidents in the last 5 years. So in 2018, Pedro Pablo Kuczynski, who was the president of Peru, was ousted by, an impeachment process was started against Pedro Pablo Kuczynski because of a corruption scandal known as the Other Bridge scandal, which was basically something that tainted all the politicians in Latin America. It tainted Juan Manuel Santos in Colombia. It tainted Pedro Pablo Kuczynski in Peru. It tainted the president of Chile in the time. Basically, everyone. It tainted also the president of Panama. Any president during the 2014 to 2018 was tainted with the Other Bridge scandal, which was basically this big enterprise and constructor of infrastructure and big railways and streets in Latin America, was accused of corruption, of embezzlement, and most of the political leaders in Latin America were tied to this corruption scandal. So in 2018, Pedro Pablo Kuczynski had an impeachment process against them because of this scandal. They ended up resigning, and then we had Vizcarra, who had also an impeachment process and ended up resigning. And lastly, we had an impeachment process in 2022 and 2021, 2022 against 2022, 2023 against Pedro Castillo, who was the last president, the last elected, like democratically elected president of Peru, who was a leftist. And basically, Pedro Castillo wanted to dissolve Congress and create a new constitution. There were serious concerns of Pedro Castillo wanting to mess with private property, mess with the education system, mess with many of the values that currently are core in Peru. And basically, before Pedro Castillo was able to dissolve Congress, the Congress made a vote of no confidence, and then Pedro Castillo was ousted, and now Dina Boluarte, who was Pedro Castillo's vice president, is the president of Peru. This has led to many uprisings, specifically in the peripheral areas of Peru, in La Sierra, basically because Pedro Castillo was a president that was promising a lot of development for these people, for these sectors of the population. and they felt betrayed by Congress when he was ousted, because many of the decisions he was going to make in his constitutional change was going to be in favor of these people from La Sierra. Lastly, Ecuador in 2023. Ecuador has something that is called muerte cruzada, and in English you would say cross death or mutual death, which is if a president is impeached, automatically the National Assembly is dissolved and general elections are called. So if a National Assembly wants to impeach a president, they have to also dissolve themselves after the impeachment and call for national elections, both for a president and for representatives of the National Assembly. Same goes for the president. If the president wants to dissolve the National Assembly, they have then to call general elections, not only for the National Assembly, but also for the place of president in Ecuador. What happened in 2023 was that there was vote of no confidence and impeachment process opened against the former president Guillermo Lasso, and Guillermo Lasso decided to use the mutual death or muerte cruzada. He dissolved the National Assembly in order for him not being impeached, and he called for general elections in which he did not run, but had someone run for him who actually won the elections. And now, well, Ecuador has a new president and a new National Assembly in light of the use of the mutual death strategy, or the mutual death constitutional strategy that they have in Ecuador. So this means that what you have is countries that, while they do have democratic processes that are somewhat secure, that are somewhat scrutinized by the international arena or the international community, you do have a lot of political instability. A lot of the constitutional protections are misused by Congress, are misused by the people. And while there is a strong and independent judiciary system, there is a lack of ability to uphold the decisions made by that judiciary system because of the fragile and corrupt institutions. So this creates civil and social unrest, because when you cannot control your government, when the judiciary system is not able to uphold their decisions, what you have is people going out to protest, going out in the streets. The problem is, this is not problematic on and of itself. The problem is the fact that it is something that is quite met with huge repression by most of the governments, with the police and even the military being used against civilians in most of the cases. So in Chile, in 2019, there were mass protests against the decision of raising the prices of the metro and many other decisions that were regressive towards the population. And the government decided to use the military against the population. So basically, they had tanks on the streets going against protesters. They had people, what's called the carabineros, which is basically the mount police, the police that goes on horses, mount police. I think you say that in English, mount police. But the mount police, and a lot of repression towards population. And this basically made the situation much worse, basically because it made people remember the oppression they felt during the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet, and this created a civil unrest that basically led to a decision of having a constitutional amendment, a decision of changing governments and choosing the president they have now that's leftist, who is Gabriel Boric. And there was an attempt to change the constitution. There was a referendum to vote that constitution, but ultimately that constitution did not pass. They have a new discussion on the constitution and a new General Assembly to discuss the constitution nowadays, and it is likely going to be voted in the near future. In Colombia, in 2019 and in 2021, we had social unrest, because of the decisions made by the right-wing president, Iván Duque, that was assigning budget in ways that was not accepted by the population. So basically, they were divesting from the peace agreement and all of the guarantees that were offered to the peripheral areas of Colombia regarding the peace process. They were divesting from the educational sector and the public university sector in Colombia. This led to mass protests that were answered with a lot of repression in the last part of 2019, November, December. And in 2021, there was a tax reform that was very regressive and that was harmful for most of the population. Evidently, most of the population went out to protest. We had them met with repression, with the military and the police being violent towards most of the population. We had deaths and disappearances during the time. And so basically, again, most of the social unrest and protests are heavily repressed by the government through the force and through violence. Then we had in Ecuador in 2019 protests against the elimination of subsidies of gas and oil, and indigenous protests against a government that is not able, or that wasn't able in the time, to respect the autonomy of the indigenous groups in Ecuador. That is a plurination, which ultimately means that there are different nations within Ecuador, basically because they respect the autonomy of the indigenous people. Mijailo, you have a doubt?
Yes, I mean, you said that these, generally the courts have some hold over the democratic process, but like how can then such terrible repressions over protesters happen?
Yeah, so the main issue we have here is courts take a lot of time to decide stuff because we have very, very big countries. For example, Colombia has a population of 44 million people, but also has a huge territory. And therefore, what we have is courts that are packed with a lot of cases. And therefore, even if there is prevalence, for example, to the protection of human rights, the protection of freedom of movement, while you have many protections and many avenues of protection, most of the times, the police do not follow those protections, do not follow the decisions of the courts. So what you have is ultimately courts that are able to, at the end of the day, months after repression has happened, be able to oust the people in power, or courts that are able to send these people to jail or have them demoted or have them sanctioned. But it is always an aftermath. It is never something that courts are able to prevent. And therefore, what you have is courts dealing with the aftermath of the issues. but most of the times as the executive power is the one that's deciding to send the police out, to send the military out, it is very difficult for Kurds to prevent these kind of situations. They work in the aftermath. And then in 2023, we had Ecuador having civil and social unrest because of the mutual death that was applied by Guillermo Lasso. And lastly, in Panama in 2023, there was this huge civil movement against a contract, a mining contract that was signed by the president that basically had most of the natural resources that Panama has being threatened by the fact that there was going to be mining in most of the protected areas in Panama. These led to mass protests that were responded through repression by the government, but in a very good example of strong judiciary system, the contract was stricken down by the Constitutional Court in the last weeks, because it goes against the natural resource protection and it goes against the Constitution and the protection of biodiversity. So that's what you have. You have perhaps executive powers that take decisions that go against the Constitution, that go against the political will or the public will of the population. But at the end of the day, you have Kurds that might take a little time into deciding and protecting these people, but at the end of the day, they do, as they did, for example, in Panama with the mining contract. Min, you have a question?
Yeah, I heard you talk about the situation in I think Ecuador, when like the president wants to dissolve the National Assembly, they have to like revote both the president and National Assembly. I want to ask, is this like something shared across all Latin American countries or just Ecuador?
It's only something that happens in Ecuador. This is not something that we have in all of the other countries. In most of the countries, they have impeachment process, but they do not have mutual death.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
Now, let's talk about international relationships and borders. So we're going to talk about Guyana, Venezuela, Colombia, and Nicaragua. So all of these that you're seeing here, besides Brazil, was controlled by the Spanish crown. But it was not divided in the countries you know now. It was not divided in Mexico, Guatemala, Colombia, Peru. You had something that was called viceroyalties. And those viceroyalties, the main ones were the one that covered Central America and was based in Mexico. You had the viceroyalty of New Grenada or Nueva Granada that covered Venezuela, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Colombia. Then you had the viceroyalty of Peru that covered Peru and Bolivia. And then you had the viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata or Plate River that was Uruguay, Paraguay, Chile, and Argentina. The problem then is, as you may see, those viceroyalties did not have the same borders we have now in Latin America. This has created many border disputes between different governments and different countries. This happens, for example, between Colombia and Venezuela in the Orinoco River. This happens between Colombia and Nicaragua with the islands of San Andrés, Providencia, and Santa Catalina. This happens, for example, between Guyana and Venezuela. What happens in Guyana and Venezuela? Guyana was sold to the UK in the past. And in that settlement of what was being sold to the UK, there are different interpretations in terms of who is in charge or who has the sovereignty over Guyana Esequiba. Nobody cared about Guyana Esequiba in the past because Guyana is a very poor country. Guyana has one of the lowest index of human dignity index in Latin America. They are very poor. They have a very low GDP. So basically, no one cared about what happened with Guyana Esequiba up until 2015, in which Exxon Petroleum found a petroleum block of over 26,000 square meters in the region. Evidently, when that happened, Venezuela started gaining an interest over the region of Guyana Esequiba. And they started saying that there was no agreement in terms of who was the owner of Guyana Esequiba region. It is estimated that when the extraction of oil and gas starts to happen in Guyana Esequiba, what you're going to have is a 25% increase in GDP up until 2027. So every year from 2023 to 2027, Guyana is going to have an increase of 25% in their GDP, and it is expected for Guyana to become the country with most oil production per capita in the world when they start exploiting the petroleum that is found in Guyana Esequiba. Evidently, this shows you why Venezuela wants now to be acknowledged as sovereign in the region. And what they have done is, in December, they did a referendum over the region. So basically, they asked Venezuelans if they wanted to be acknowledged as sovereigns over the region and to recognize as Venezuelan the people in Guyana Esequiba, basically giving them the nationality. The referendum passed, evidently, but the problem is, it is quite unclear why is it that the referendum should happen in Venezuela and not in Guyana Esequiba, because they did not ask the population in Guyana Esequiba if they wanted to be part of Venezuela, and most of the population in Guyana Esequiba feels like part of Guyana and not part of Venezuela. In Guyana Esequiba, there are people from Venezuela, but these people currently, after the tensions started, they have been suffering a lot of discrimination. They have been their transition permits have been suspended or terminated, and basically most of the population who's Venezuelan, who's currently living in Guyana, is suffering the discrimination in light of the tensions that have been happening in Guyana, between Guyana and Venezuela. Venezuela has sent their military to the border, and basically Guyana has been eager to receive the help of the United States in protecting the region. And Venezuela has started a process in the International Court of Justice for them to decide what are the borders between Venezuela and Guyana, and basically to be able to delimit the border in the Guyana Esequiba region and see if Venezuela can win part of the region and the petroleum that can be found there. What is the problem? The problem is the ICJ has not said anything about the referendum that has been done in Venezuela. They have started the process of or the preliminary actions into looking at the border conflict and who owns what in the region, but they have not said anything about the referendum. basically Maduro wants to start acting over the referendum. Maduro has already named someone to be the governor of Guyana Esequiba because of the referendum. This person has already been sent to the border in order to start making acts of seniorship over the region. And this has created a lot of tensions. This has created the need of Guyana to start sending their military. Suriname, that is also near the region, has already sent their military. Lula da Silva is in Brazil, is talking about sending military in order to support Venezuela. So basically, there is a rising tension. I would be skeptical of saying the tensions are going to rise to the level of a conflict, but in fact, there are tensions in the region, and the US is looking closely into the situation. They have sent part of their military to different parts of Guyana in the last weeks. Similarly, has happened between Colombia and Nicaragua. Colombia, that is here, this is Colombia, this is Panama. Colombia has some islands here next to Nicaragua. Those islands are called San Andrés, Providencia, and Santa Catalina. Those islands were given to Colombia by Nicaragua in a treaty that's called 𝐏𝐸𝐹. Basically, Nicaragua says 𝐏𝐸𝐹 has no validity, has no value, is not an enforceable treaty, and therefore they say that San Andrés, Providencia, and Santa Catalina are their land, and that Colombia is invading. Why is it that they care about these islands? Because if you see, the fact that Colombia has islands here gives them continental platform and control over the sea all over here, in terms of fishing, in terms of looking for natural resources, in terms of fracking, in terms of oil and gas. So ultimately, this helps Colombia widen the sea control they have over the region, and it helps Colombia have a bigger continental platform in which they can exploit natural resources. Evidently, Nicaragua wants the control over that continental platform in order to exploit it. They went to the ICJ in 2010, in 2009, in 2010, to have the ICJ pronounce itself in terms of who owned San Andrés, Providencia, and Santa Catalina. Ultimately, what happened is, in 2012, the ICJ said, yes, San Andrés, Providencia, and Santa Catalina are part of Colombia, but the amount of sea that Colombia has is, in fact, a mistake. And it took away from Colombia 70,000 square meters of sea, which ultimately harms the ability of Colombia to exploit natural resources in the region. What did Colombia do? Well, Colombia in 2012 said, oh, I do not agree with this decision made by the ICJ. I am going to withdraw myself from the ICJ. But the problem is that was unsuccessful, because the conflict and the procedure started before 2012, and therefore it was enforceable to Colombia. What Colombia says now is that it is impossible constitutionally to apply the decision of the ICJ, and therefore that they are not going to apply it. They have sent military to make presence in the region. Evidently, Nicaragua doesn't like this. They went again to in 2023. There was the second ruling because Colombia evidently appealed. And the appeal gives more seat to Colombia, but not as much as Colombia was expecting. This basically has created a controversy in terms of if Colombia is bound by what the ICJ says, even if applying what the ICJ says is unconstitutional. So what you see here is that, yes, most of the countries, when they have borders disputes, and also there has been border disputes by Peru and Bolivia, by Chile and Bolivia, by, I don't know, many Brazil and Ecuador in the Amazon. They go to the ICJ, but they ultimately never follow what the ICJ says, because they say they cannot apply it because the Constitution prohibits so. So ultimately what you have is a lack of confidence and a lack of enforcing of the decision making by the ICJ, which is likely going to happen again in Guyana and Venezuela, because it is likely that if the ICJ ultimately says that Guyana and Esequiba is not part of Venezuela, what Venezuela is going to say is that they do not follow the orders of the ICJ. They are likely going to pull out of the ICJ, as they did, for example, of the Organization of American States when they were sanctioned because of the poor democratic elections they have. So basically, there is no enforcement of the decisions that the ICJ can do in terms of borders. It ultimately creates tensions, but the reality is these tensions have never translated into actual conflict in all of the situations they have happened in the past. So now, let's talk about migration and the problem of migration in Latin America. So let's start off by talking about the Venezuelan diaspora in Latin America. So evidently, you may be familiar with the fact that Venezuela has an autocratic government led by Maduro, and that most of the opposition politicians are incarcerated. You have Leopoldo López, you have you have Juan Guaidó, you have most of the politicians who make opposition incarcerated or persecuted by the government. You may know or may not know that as of 2 years ago, Juan Guaidó was self-proclaimed and recognized by the US as the president of Venezuela. So basically, you have Maduro, who is the de facto president, and you have Juan Guaidó, who has self-proclaimed himself as the president of Venezuela. He is one of the leaders of the opposition. He has been recognized as the president of Venezuela by, for example, the US. This evidently has given more power to Maduro by saying that the US is meddling in political, in internal political affairs of Venezuela. And basically, what you have is a country that has a lot of inflation, that does not have political guarantees, that has a lot of unemployment, that has a lot of social issues, and this has created mass migration within the region. Nowadays, there is, up until November 2023, there are estimated 6.5 million Venezuelans all over Latin America. 1/3 of those 6.5 millions, more than 1/3, are in Colombia. So Colombia nowadays has 2.8 million Venezuelans in their country, and many of the countries in the region are currently struggling with the amount of Venezuelan diaspora that they have to account for. This evidently is people who are impoverished, people who have health issues, people who have no access to the main services that the government has. So, for example, here in Colombia, we have started giving them permits of stay in the region in order for them to be able to go to school, to use the public services, to have healthcare. But ultimately, this has created a very strong pressure in the social system in Colombia that is already pressured by the mere fact that we have a lot of poverty and a lot of inequality in the country. And therefore, this has created a lot of xenophobia against Venezuelans, because most of the politicians in the country characterize Venezuelans as people who are going against the interests of the Colombians, who are using the public services that Colombians should be benefiting from, who are going against the security of the people because they come and rob people, because they come and go against the basic values that we have in Colombia, which is quite xenophobic. But ultimately, this funnels most of the political discussion in terms of how to deal with Venezuelans. Most of the population, or a huge part of the population, is against receiving Venezuelans. But the problem is the frontier or the borders we have with Venezuela are so big, and they are basically covered by a river, that is very difficult for the Colombian government to actually close the frontier. But secondly, as we do have a leftist president now, the president has decided to open borders, to open legitimately the ability of Venezuelans to enter the country. The president has decided to normalize relationships with Venezuela, which ultimately has incentivized even more the migration from Venezuelans to Colombia. Miguel.
Yes, I mean, if that is such a big political issue, how was that then? How can he have the political capital to do such an unpopular decision on such a wide scale?
The problem is Petro nowadays has 66% of disapproval in Colombia, but Colombia doesn't have an impeachment process. And secondly, Petro controls, even if he has 66% of public disapproval, Petro controls the Congress. So there is no such thing as political control that we have nowadays. And Petro is doing things such as saying that the Kurds should not meddle in political decisions. He's trying to change the attorney general here in Colombia. So basically, we do have issues in the future with division of power. So that's why Petro is managing to do so. But ultimately, we have protests that go against Petro monthly now. So opposition parties call for protests in most of the situations. But the problem is most of the people who are against Petro are people who are part of the elite. So the problem is these people do not go out and protest much. They do not do this kind of massive protest and like massive unrest in which they go against public transportation, in which they close streets, because it goes against their own vision of how protests should look like. And ultimately it means that it basically does not harm much the government, and it does not harm much the ability of the government to have stability within Congress and within most of the population. And the second problem is that even if Petro has such high disapproval, the problem is Petro has disapproval in the center of the country, but not on the peripheries, because the peripheries were heavily neglected by the right-wing politicians in the past. And even if Petro is doing a very, very bad job, they still think that Petro is working towards helping them. So he has populist reforms in terms of labor for people to have more extra hours, so that people cannot be sacked without cause from their work, to have protection of workers in most of the instances. So ultimately, most of these populistic reforms gains him the approval of the periphery, and ultimately in the periphery is where you have the border control. So these people are okay with Petro making these decisions. So in the center, everyone is against Petro, but in the periphery, most of the people think Petro is the only option they have towards development and towards the protection of their rights. Does that make sense? I am going to take silence as a yes. Okay, so the problem then is this Venezuelan diaspora is creating a lot of pressure in the social systems of most of these countries, is creating a lot of xenophobia, and basically this Venezuelan this Venezuelan population is ultimately creating a migrant crisis in most of the countries, because the countries cannot prepare themselves for the sheer amount of population that they are receiving. This also is happening in El Tapón del Darién, which is this part between Colombia and Panama. This is Panama, this is Colombia, and this is how do you say this in English? I'm going to look for it because I don't know how you say this in English. Jungle. Yes, so this is called tapón, which is basically saying that it is unpenetrable. So El Tapón del Darién is a jungle between Colombia and Panama, and basically it's the only way in which you can pass by land towards the US. This is the only access you have to Central America. Tapón del Darién is very, very dangerous, not only in a natural way because of the animals, because of the malaria, because of all of the issues that a jungle has, but also it is very, very insecure, because this is where the Gulf clan del Golfo, which is the biggest narco group in Colombia as of now, exists and has the routes to go to the US by land. So this is a land that is controlled currently by criminals. The Colombian government has no control over the land. The Panamanian government has no control over the land. And most of the migrants from the whole Latin American region, so you have Cubans, Peruvians, Ecuadorians, Venezuelans, trying to go through the Tapón del Darién. How they do so? By paying Clan del Golfo, by paying the Gulf clan in order to pass and to be helped to be passed. This ultimately creates a lot of people dying in the process. Most of the migrants that have gone through Tapón del Darién say the whole, this is, you say, it's not big, but it's very dense. It's not in terms of longitude, but in terms of density. It's a very, very dense jungle. So this is no more than, you say, 50, 60 kilometers, but it is very dense, and people take days crossing it. And they say the smell, because of the dead bodies, because of the animals eating the dead bodies, is something that they cannot explain and something that has left them traumatized. As of now, in Tapón del Darién, 360,000 people have crossed in 2023. And for example, in terms of the amount of Colombians that have crossed Tapón del Darién in this year, there has been an increase of 214%. So basically, this is becoming a migrant crisis in which what they are doing is fostering the business of the Gulf Plan in the region and is strengthening their control over the region. Panama says Colombia is not doing enough, and evidently Colombia says Panama is not doing enough. But basically, both countries agree that this is not only a problem that they should be solving on and of themselves, because the problem is they are receiving the population from all the other Latin American countries, and therefore it should be something that is done internationally instead of nationally. There has been no agreement whatsoever about how to deal with the situation. Basically, the way in which Colombia has dealt with this is by deporting this population, but it's very difficult to do so when there is no info on who are these people, where they come from, and whatever. It has gone to the level in which now we have people from Africa trying to go through Tapón del Darién. So they come from Turkey by plane to Colombia. They go by foot from Bogota to Tapón del Darién, which is weeks of walking. People from Asia and Africa are doing this, and it's very difficult for Colombia to deport these people or to nationalize them because we don't even have consulates from the countries they come from in the region. For example, we have now a problem with a lot of people coming from Guinea, and the problem is the only consulate or the most proximate consulate is in Brazil. So Colombia has no way of nationalizing these people, of giving them the services and the social guarantees they need, because they do not have a diplomatic relation with most of the countries that people come from. Ultimately, there was an agreement that was being negotiated by Colombia and the US that is similar to the US migration and financing agreements that the US has with Mexico and Guatemala, which was basically the US helping Colombia normalize the migrant situation in the country, provide security in the borders in order to control the influx of population in those borders. And lastly, the ability of Colombia to have financing from the US in order to keep those migrants, or B, to be able to tell the US who were those migrants, to what extent they needed refugee status, in order for the US to accept them once they are in Colombia and not when they reach the United States, in order for them not to have all this crossing, but also for the US to be able to say no before they arrive to their country, and therefore leaving them in Colombia and say, well, Colombia, that's your problem, I'm giving you money to sort this out, which is the agreement they have with Mexico and Guatemala. They have an agreement with both Guatemala and Mexico. In order for them, Guatemala receives all these people who are walking over to the US. And Mexico receives people that are able to bypass Guatemala. And what the US has done in these agreements is saying to Mexico and Guatemala, hey, once you receive these people, you ask them if they want refugee status or asylum in the US, you send those requests to me, I accept them or don't accept them, but they do not reach my border. They do not reach Arizona, they do not reach New Mexico, they do not reach California. So when I withdraw or when I do not give them their refugee status, when I do not give them their asylum seeking, what happens is that they need to stay in Mexico and Guatemala. And that's the way the US washes its hands in terms of those migrants. What does the US give to Mexico and Guatemala in exchange for this? Basically, money. I pay you, I give you security, I give you more border control, but you take care of these people. You do not let them through to the US. Ultimately meaning that these agreements might seem beneficial to these countries, but at the end of the day, what the US is doing is letting them deal with the migrant crisis and with all the social and humanitarian issues that these migrants create because of the sheer amount of needs they have, but also because of the sheer amount of people that they compromise on. So those are the things in terms of international relations of borders and in terms of migration that Latin America is dealing with as of now. Lastly, economics. So first of all, an economic alliances, I don't think this is going to be something that should debate at WUDC because it's very similar to what was said at Madrid last year. But there are two other alliances in Latin America other than the Pacific Alliance that was debated in round 3. We have Mercosur and we have Comunidad Andina de Naciones or Andean Community of Nations. Mercosur is comprised of Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay. And basically what they have is a common market in which they have the same tariffs and the same taxes to imports and exports in order to foster the trade within the region. Formerly, Venezuela was also part of Mercosur, but evidently their membership was suspended when Maduro came into power because of the democratic elections not being not having the minimum guarantees that Mercosur asks for. What is the problem with Mercosur? That Mercosur, even if it has created a common market, that common market has not been strong enough, because of political will. If we go back to here, you may see that Argentina is now right, Uruguay is right, Paraguay is right, Brazil is left, and Chile is left. Ultimately meaning that their ability to reach consensus, their ability to collaborate is meaningfully diminished by the different views in terms of economic development that these countries have, and ultimately also harmed by the fact that there are no supranational agencies or committees within Mercosur, but is basically having ministers sit down and talk out the decision-making in Mercosur, but there is no supranational committee that makes them enforceable, ultimately meaning that Mercosur exists, but most of the times doesn't have a common public policy that can foster adequately trade. The second economic alliance that we have in Latin America is the Andean Community of Nations, or by its acronym in Spanish, CAN, or CAN, and it's joined by Colombia, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Peru. Similarly to the problem of Mercosur, but a little bit more intense, Comunidad Andina de Naciones does not have the same tariffs and the same taxes or a common or a common way of dealing with exports and imports. What does the Andean Community of Nations have? The free transit of people within the region. So, for example, people from Colombia can travel just with their ID to Peru, to Bolivia, and to Ecuador. They do not need a passport. They do not need a visa. They do not have to meet a lot of standards that other people from other countries in the region have to meet. And also they have some protections in terms of intellectual property, in terms of IP and patents. So basically, most of the patent regulation in Colombia, Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador is not done nationally, but done communally between the Andean community of nations in order for the development of the economy to be fostered by the protection of IP in all of the region. Now, briefly, because I am running out of time for questions in the future, let's talk about economics, Argentina, Javier Milei, and dollarization. As you may know, Argentina is enduring a very hard economic crisis. They have a very high inflation. They have the second biggest inflation, just being surpassed by my friend Venezuela. And basically, the problem in Argentina is the devaluation of the peso, the Argentinian peso, and the fact that the government is heavily indebted with the IMF and has not been able to pay the loans. And basically, they have restructured those loans over time, ultimately harming the confidence that exists between the business sector or the real sector and the Central Bank of Argentina, because basically they have never been able to pay their debt. They always have to restructure it. And this has been characterized as by the current president as mishandling of the economic situation by the central bank. And therefore, for the president, the most intelligent thing to do now is to dollarize Argentina in order for the central bank to disappear and be dissolved, and for Argentina to depend entirely on the decisions made by the Federal Reserve of the United States. This has been done in Ecuador, that has a dollarized economy, and this has also been somewhat made in Panama, in which they have a currency called Martinelli, but the Martinelli is tied to the dollar. One Martinelli is $1, so basically Panama is dollarized. Panama does not have a central bank. Panama does not issue Martinellis. They just have the $1 coin is a Balboa, but it is basically just tradable in Panama. You cannot go and trade a Balboa for anything in anywhere. Cannot trade a Balboa for $1. It is basically a make-believe coin. But so these are the two countries that are dollarized in Latin America. And then Javier Milei is proposing dollarizing Argentina in order to solve the crisis. And he has started in the last weeks by doing actions that might help in the future make the dollarization a more smooth process. So basically, in the last week, what he has done is he has devaluated the currency in 55%. He has cut subsidies and has created a non-public spending plan in terms of infrastructure, in terms of the building of public infrastructure. And ultimately, what he expects this to do is A, cut public spending in order for the government not to create more debt and be able to service the debt that they already have. And secondly, it has devaluated the currency in order for the exports of Argentina to be more competitive in the market. What is the problem? The problem is that currently Argentina has different exchange rates. So ultimately that devaluation is making the Argentinian products cheaper in terms of who buys it, but as the exchange rate inside Argentina is different and it's controlled by the government, ultimately what is happening is that the people who are exporting, when they go and change those dollars for pesos, are losing out money because the exchange rate is not common within the country. The exchange rate for exports is different than the exchange rate for imports, ultimately meaning that when they try to change that money, those dollars that they are receiving, they are losing out money. So perhaps, yes, more people are going to buy exports from Argentina, but that is not actually and meaningfully going to translate to better resources and to more like well-being for the population. But secondly, this devaluation is actually creating more inflation within Argentina, because now what you were able to buy with 1 peso is 55% less than what you were able to buy yesterday, ultimately meaning that the levels of inflation are rising in Argentina. The second thing Javier Milei has done in Argentina is a bureaucratic reform, in which what he has done is to cut public spending. He has eliminated ministries and secretariats. So before Milei went into power, Argentina had 18 ministries, and now he has eliminated 9 of them. So Argentina has now only 9 ministries. He eliminated the health ministry, the education ministry, the equality ministry, the ministry of the woman, and basically has created one big ministry for all social things. So everything regarding health, equality, women, education is joined in one ministry. Similarly, he has done with the secretariats. Before, Argentina had 106 secretariats. Now it has 54. And this now means that ultimately Milei has been able to cut 54% of the hierarchical political positions in the country. And he is announcing a lot of constitutional reforms in terms of he's going to change the constitution in order to allow the privatization of public enterprises. He's going to he's going to cut the subsidies and the public planning in most of the social benefits areas. So he's going to cut in terms of the health system. He's going to cut in terms of the education system. He wants to fully privatize the health and the education system. He wants to change the amount of subsidies and the amount of budgetary planning that goes into the service of subsidies for production. He wants to remove tariffs from most of the products that are being exported as of now. He wants to eliminate the protections that the local industry has in order to create incentives for competitiveness in the region. And lastly, natural resource exploitation. So a little bit similar to what happened in Panama happens in most of the countries in Latin America, especially because most of the natural resources that these countries have are situated coincidentally in indigenous lands. So what you have is, for example, the fact that the Amazon has a lot of indigenous groups that are protected by constitutions, that have autonomy over their land and how they engage with it. This is, for example, the indigenous land that was part of the mining contract in Panama, or, for example, the local agricultural workers that own the land in which mining is done in Colombia. So in most of these countries, we have something that is called consulta previa, or previous consultation, in which the government has to ask just the local population if they are okay with doing natural resource exploitation on the land. So it is not a national referendum, but a local referendum in which people can say and can decide if they want their land to be exploited. The problem here in Colombia is, for example, that there are pushes into previous consultation not to be legally binding, but just something that enlightens governments. And ultimately, this has created somewhat of social unrest in terms of the way this land is exploited, in terms of how is it that indigenous land is protected. And ultimately, at the same time, it creates a tension because governments engage in international contracts with MNCs to exploit in terms of, I don't know, in terms of natural resources, in terms of mining, in terms of coal, gold, I don't know, salt, lithium. They make all these international contracts with MNCs such as Anglo Gold Ashanti from Canada, which is one of the biggest mining industries here in Colombia. And ultimately, they end up having to do previous consultation. The population goes against the will of the government of letting those natural resources be exploited. And what happens at the end of the day is that the government has to tell these MNCs that they cannot enter the region, that they cannot exploit, even if they have a contract. And ultimately, what these MNCs do is they sue the Colombian, the Brazilian, the Panamanian, the Peruvian government in the International Center of Settlement for Investment Disputes. And the Colombian, Brazilian, Peruvian government, Panamanian government are found to have been going against the good faith of investment, doing what it's called indirect expropriation. And ultimately, they have these huge sanctions over the government of Colombia. So basically, for example, we have this huge, in Colombia, we have this huge fine by the International Center of Settlement of Investment Disputes that was upheld in 2017, and it's basically 3% of our GDP. So ultimately, the protection of natural resources in Latin America, even if effective, even if successful, is harming the ability of governments to have an adequate spending in social affairs, in dealing with the needs of the population, because ultimately what happens at the end of the day is that the governments are heavily burdened by these fines that are being implemented because of the indirect expropriation they do. Mihailo, tell me.
I wanted to ask, like, how are these indigenous communities so well protected and so powerful in order to push for their protection to such extent against the populist ability of government?
So most of the constitutions in Latin America have something that creates a multi-ethnic state. So basically, most of the constitutions in Latin America recognize the ability of indigenous communities to give themselves their own constitution, their own lawmaking, Even, for example, indigenous people here in Colombia don't go to criminal courts or to the criminal justice system. They have their own criminal justice system. They do not go up to a judge that is white or that it's mixed race. They go to their own judges. They have their own lawmaking. They have their own constitution. They have their own governments. So ultimately, these people are recognized by constitution as autonomous and independent. And the constitution is bound, and the government is bound by constitution to respect the decisions that these indigenous people make. If the government doesn't do so, what the indigenous people go is they go to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights that basically then goes and fines and sanctions the government. So ultimately, the courts protect them a lot. They ultimately show that these contracts are non-binding, but what is characterized or argument, like what is the defense that these MNCs have in their side is that this is an indirect expropriation, because basically they entered in good faith. They entered into a legal system that told them that it was okay to do these contracts. They had good faith in terms of that the government was going to uphold those contracts. And then when the parallel legal system of the indigenous community comes into play, what they say is, I didn't know, I didn't have control. I thought that I was negotiating with the government that had control over everything, and now you're saying that you don't. So either you give me an indemnization, you give me reparations because you took out the contract from me, or you let me keep exploiting. The courts say, I am not letting you keep exploiting. I am going to force the government to pay you reparations because of your indirect expropriation. But ultimately, the problem is that you have two legal systems existing, and this legal system of the indigenous people has constitutional protection and has international protection by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. And therefore, these people can, these rights of the people always are upheld eventually, and therefore these MNCs are expropriated indirectly. So I think that is all. I don't know if you have any questions, if you want more info on anything, whatever you want to chat about. I am going to take the silence as a no. Thank you very much for hearing my ramble during these almost 2 hours. Oh, I have a question here. So we have a question in terms of the way borders were split out after viceroyalties were no longer in effect. So ultimately, what happened is that in most of the situations, for example, after the independence of the Spanish crown, most of the countries made international agreements in terms of borders. What was the problem? That during the independence, there were no clear notion of who was the president, who was the ruling party of the countries that were new to the to the world. Basically, for example, when Colombia was created and Venezuela was created, it was unclear who was ruling Colombia, who was ruling Venezuela. So what they argue nowadays is that those international agreements are not legally binding because the people who made the agreement and who negotiated did not have the power to do so. So ultimately, yes, the agreements exist. There is a delimitation, but ultimately all countries say, no, 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 they did not have the power to do that agreement. That agreement is not legally binding. That's what happens, for example, with Colombia and Nicaragua with 𝐻𝐵𝐺𝐻 Bárcenas. 𝐻𝐵𝐻 Bárcenas is super clear in terms of how you divide the sea in terms of San Andrés and Nicaragua. But what Nicaragua says is that 𝐻𝐵𝐻 Bárcenas is not legally binding because it was not done like in the proper way, and in the way in which the Vienna Accords say that international treaties should be upheld and should be implemented. So ultimately, those agreements exist, but most of the times countries say that they are not legally binding because of the process and the procedure the process they had to follow in order for those international agreements to be legally binding. So ultimately, they negotiated. It was somewhat in agreement in the past, but now current governments are questioning the ability that the people who went to the table of negotiation, the ability they had to represent their own country. So what they are saying is, oh, yes, these people went and negotiated with you, but these people did not have the sovereignty or the power. They were not adequately representing the government because the government was represented by these other people. The people in the table of negotiation had the power to negotiate these borders. What they say is the international agreement they reached to did not follow the procedure it needed in order to be legally binding. So I am not to be forced to comply to what this agreement says. Probably what they do is there are many agreements, because you have the previous agreement to 𝐻𝐵𝐻 Bárcenas. They go then to negotiate again because perhaps they do not have the same I don't know, they think they can access a better situation, so they go and they make an agreement with someone else, and they start again negotiations in terms of the borders. And what governments say is, oh, this one is not beneficial to me, so what I'm going to say is that this last treaty is not legally binding, that the legally binding is the one that was done 30 years beforehand, or the one that is binding is the one that was done 100 years beforehand. So ultimately, there is no clear notion of which is the treaty that is ultimately legally binding, and that is why they go to the ICJ in order for the ICJ to say which of the treaties is legally binding. So basically, that's why the division of borders is not as clear in most of the cases in Latin America, because of the way negotiations were held after viceroyalties were eliminated. Okay, I think that's all. If you have any questions, as always, you can reach me through Facebook, through Facebook mainly. But I hope this was enlightening, and I hope you never say that all countries in Latin America are like Venezuela. Please do not say so. I will be heartbroken. But yeah, thank you very much for listening to me during this whole 2 hours.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.